thank you, Ann, for that kind introduction. Yeah, I had my baptism by fire in the whole pro-life movement back in China in 1980. I was there on a scholarship. The U.S. government had selected me to be in the first wave of foreign scholars to go and study in China. I, at the time, was at Stanford University, and of course, having studied at one of the high temples of secular humanism, I was firmly convinced. When I went to China in March of 1979 that China had a population problem. And I was also convinced that abortion was a woman's choice, although I confess that I'd never really thought about the question of abortion because I left that in the hands of the other sex. I got to China just as the most horrific population control program the world has ever seen was getting started. You know it as the one-child policy, but when you're on the ground in China, it actually looks more like a program for hunting down pregnant women, arresting them for the crime of being pregnant, taking them by force to lockups, to jails, where they're held until they give their consent in quotes, for an abortion. They are then taken under escort to a local medical clinic where they are aborted and, in most cases, subsequently sterilized. They combine the two operations because they don't want these women who have gotten pregnant with illegal children to be pregnant again the following year with more illegal children. So it's a program of forced abortion, forced sterilization. The ones who aren't sterilized are contracepted. The preferred means of contraception in China is a steel ring IUD inserted in the uterus because steel ring IUDs show up on x-rays. And so it's easy to parade the women in front of x-ray machines and make sure that they're still properly contracepted. I shouldn't even use the word contraceptive where an IUD is concerned because an IUD, of course, changes the microenvironment of the uterus and prevents the conception of already conceived babies, prevents implantation, which, of course, the World Health Organization defines pregnancy as beginning at implantation, but everybody who's ever had high school biology knows that pregnancy begins at conception. So there I was in a village when this program descended upon the Chinese people. I had friends of mine living in houses down the alleyway where I was living who were arrested for the crime of being pregnant. I went with them as they were taken to a lockup. I remember being in a tiny room. There were 18 women being held in this room, all from my village, the village I was living in South China. They were being subjected to morning to night, what were called study sessions, but which were more properly called brainwashing sessions, because what happened all day long, from morning until night, was after the morning meal of rice gruel, Communist Party officials, mostly men, would come in one after the other and harangue these women, would threaten these women, would tell them they had no choice but to get an abortion. And that went on until sunset when they got their second meal of the day, another bowl or two of rice. There were no beds in these rooms. There were simple wooden benches with no backs to them. The women were held there day after day, week after week, in these little torture chambers with no place really to lie down. The floor was dirt. They kept the 25-watt bulb on day and night. It didn't really illuminate things, but it did make it difficult to sleep at night. And of course, the women were in terrible shape emotionally. Most of them were 6, 7, 8, and even 9 months pregnant. And I will never forget when one of the Communist Party officials who was there to browbeat them said, pointing at a woman on the front bench, "You there who are 9 months pregnant, don't think that you can simply sit through these meetings and eat the government's rice until you go into labor, because we will not allow you to give birth. If you go into labor before you give us permission to do an abortion, we will simply take your baby at birth." Now, that was a threat of what? That was a threat of infanticide. And I'm here to tell you that that threat was actually carried out. There are women today in China who are in labor when they are discovered by the authorities to be pregnant with a quote-unquote illegal child. They are rushed then to the nearest clinic or hospital. The doctors wait until the baby's head is crowning. Most children, of course, 95% are born head first. And then they inject formaldehyde or alcohol into the soft spot of the child's skull, which is intended to and does cause in almost instantaneous death. So that the baby, when it's born, a few minutes later, because remember, after crowning, what happens? Everything else passes very quickly. When the baby is born, it's born dead. And I asked the head of a major military hospital in South China a few years ago, did that constitute infanticide? He said, oh no. He said, as long as the baby is still partially in the birth canal, it's a legal abortion. Well, it would be a subject for another talk, but of course we can claim no moral superiority in that situation because abortion in this country is legal up to the point of parturition as well. And there is a lot of coercion on women in this country by boyfriends, by school counselors, by society at large. But that's what I saw in China, and I saw something else in China. I saw women who were 6, 7, 8 months pregnant given abortions by cesarean section. And what they would do is they would bring the women into the operating room, they would give them a poison shot into the uterus, directly into the unborn child. The poison shot was intended to cause the death of the unborn child and also cause uterine contractions. So the baby would be born 24, 48 hours later, dead. The baby invariably died, but sometimes the uterine contractions didn't begin on time, and so the doctors then would go in and do a cesarean section abortion. They would make the incision, a C-section incision, low transverse incision, and remove the now dead baby. I was present for these injections, for these forced abortions, for these C-section abortions, and I will tell you that I instantly became pro-life. I mentioned earlier I hadn't thought about the question of abortion up to that point in time. Now I was confronted with it in a way that I could not ignore. And I saw what an abortion actually was. I realized that an abortion was the taking of the life of an innocent unborn child. And of course, the wounding of the mother at the same time. These women were wounded not just in body by these operations. They were wounded in spirit as well. I remember being in the with women who had already been given these lethal injections, and they were waiting, lying on their simple wooden beds, waiting for their babies to stop moving because their babies had been poisoned and were dying from this poison injection. And the faces of these women were just masks of grief. And I'll tell you one more thing that will make it very clear how much women in China are suffering. China has the highest suicide rate in the world. But there's something odd about the suicide rate in China. It's different from the suicide rates in the rest of the world because everywhere else in the world you look, men commit suicide at a higher rate than women. Probably having something to do with the fact that women are naturally more nurturing and capable of taking care of themselves than men, as we who are married know. In China, it's the reverse. In China, the suicide rate among women is much higher than the suicide rate among men. In fact, it's so high that China's average suicide rate is the highest in the world. And that's a direct consequence of the fact that tens of millions of Chinese women have been forced to coerced into participating in the death of their children, children that were conceived in love and whose birth they eagerly anticipated and who were ripped out of their wombs by the coercive power of the state. So I became pro-life in that instant. It took me a little longer to think through the whole question of population. I'm sad to say I went into China thinking that, yeah, China had too many people. But when I was able to talk to the Chinese people alone, without the presence of local officials, they blamed their problems on something else. They said, you know, we used to farm our own land, but after the collectivization of the 1950s, the government took our land from us. And the government criticized, the Communist Party criticizes the landlords and shot many of the landlords and rich peasants after they came to power. But we call the government the big landlord because now it owns all the land. And it takes our crops at a fraction of their value and sells them and makes a huge profit on the turnaround, while we eat less well than we did before the Communist Party came to power. So their complaints which they didn't dare utter in public, of course, but in private, in the evening with me sitting around over a glass of rice wine, they would tell me that their problems came from too much government. Government that tried to control all aspects of their lives, including how many children they should have. And this is the other thing about the one-child policy. This is the state, the People's Republic of China, declaring not only that it has the right to regulate the number of bicycles and tons of steel produced every year in the country, but it also has the right to regulate human fertility, taking over, expropriating, as it were, the reproductive faculties of every person in the country, and moving reproduction under a state plan, just as in the old days they used to control production under a state plan, and deciding every year how many babies could be born. And when they made that decision, of course, they were also deciding how many babies would die, because babies conceived outside the plan were not allowed to live. Where does China's one-child policy come from? Well, it was made in the West. It is a product of the radical environmental movement that we've had in this country and in Western Europe for the last 50 years. We have evidence of that fact. We know that after the Club of Rome in 1974 published a report saying that the world was running out of food and fuel and chromium and zinc and so forth because of population growth, we know that study, which predicted demographic and economic and environmental collapse within 100 years if we didn't reduce the population of the world. That study was in 1978 taken by a Chinese systems engineer, translated into Chinese, and presented to China's senior leaders at a meeting. It was presented as the latest and greatest in Western science. And Deng Xiaoping, China's senior leader, who was desperate to have China adopt the latest and greatest of Western science, said, well, it's clear that the West is engaging in population control so that they can get ahead of China. China now has to engage in population control so we can keep up with the West. We can catch up with the West. And he asked the systems engineer, what should we do? And the systems engineer said, we need to adopt a one-child policy. Now, I'm not saying that the Club of Rome or the radical environmentalists designed China's one-child policy in terms of how it's carried out. But I am saying the idea for the one-child policy came from the radical environmental movement in the West, from groups like Negative Population Growth in the United States, which believe that our country is overpopulated and the proper carrying capacity of the United States is something under 100 million. They've never told us what they're going to do with the other 200 million of us. But you can imagine what they might have in mind. They also think the world is overpopulated. They think that we're closing in on 7 billion people and the world can only sustain a population of about 1 billion. Again, they haven't told us what they're going to do with the other 6 billion of us. But we can get a clue by looking at what's happening in China. Now, the Population Research Institute that I direct has a couple of very clever young men who are good at doing computer animation. They were born with computers, unlike me. And I want to show you one of these now, because this makes it clear in a short 2-minute video, I think, that the world is not overpopulated. And I think I can turn down the lights, and if I click on this twice, I'm told that things will happen.
The myth of overpopulation originated in England in 1798, when a vicar named Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, saw that food production increased incrementally, but people reproduced exponentially. He sat down and did some simple math, and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates, and recommended killing off the have-nots of society, lest the haves starve to death. This cry was taken up by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University in 1968. who claimed that reckless human reproduction had overwhelmed the Earth. Massive famines would result, which would destroy, best case scenario, 1/5 of humanity by the end of the 70s. And the planet would follow. This fear produced large donations for the newly created UNFPA, which thrives on an imagined crisis that has been both imminent and rescheduled again and again over the past 2 centuries. The truth of the matter is that every family on this planet could have a house with a yard and all live together on a landmass the size of Texas, which is really just a small corner of the planet. The population of Earth will peak in 30 years and then start to go back down. We're not overpopulated. Do the math.
Okay, that's the whole population question in a nutshell. Paul Ehrlich was a colleague of mine at Stanford University. He's still there, I think, as professor emeritus. After I came back from China in the early 1980s, bearing information about forced abortions and forced sterilizations, many people at Stanford were very upset. They were upset at me because I had made it difficult for them to go to China and do research. The Chinese government was also very upset. One of the things the Chinese government did to show their displeasure was they sent a confidential document to Stanford demanding that I be punished for my crimes against the Chinese people. My crimes against the Chinese people consisted of telling the truth about the human rights abuses that the Chinese government was committing against the Chinese people. But Stanford, which was some of my colleagues at Stanford, were also continued to labor under the illusion that China was actually overpopulated and that the best thing they could do for the country was to reduce their numbers. Another one said to me, well, I'm personally opposed to forced abortion. This is precious. He said, I'm personally opposed to forced abortion in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. But it's nothing worse than the Reagan administration denying federal funding for abortions for poor women. Well, I thought about that one, and I said, oh, how in the world can you possibly morally equate those two things? On the one hand, you have the government forcibly aborting women who are carrying viable unborn children. On the other hand, you have the principled refusal of the Reagan administration to fund abortions, which most Americans find reprehensible and which most Americans do not want their tax dollars going to pay for. Well, that was, I think, the last time we had a conversation. I didn't convince him, needless to say. But I was asked to leave Stanford University. I was fired from Stanford. And it's actually the best thing that happened to me because it freed me from a life of tenured servitude to do the work that I think God has called me to do, and that is to talk about whether or not there are too many people on the planet, whether or not there are too many people in China. You know, the Chinese government now brags that over the last 31 years of the one-child policy, they have eliminated 400 million people from the population. 400 million people. They claim that as a result of eliminating 400 million people, they've made a great contribution to stopping global warming. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked into global warming, but I went through a PhD program in biological oceanography years before I went through one in cultural anthropology. And it is clear from studies of ancient history, including one that I've done, that temperatures on the planet have fluctuated cyclically, long before we invented the internal combustion engine. So that is another question. But when you think about China, ask yourself, China has seen double-digit economic growth over the last 30 years. Its economy has been growing at a rate of about 10% a year. By means of the one-child policy, it has reduced its population growth down to almost nothing. But when it started back in 1980, the average Chinese family was not having 9 children like the Moshers. The average Chinese family was having 3, and the birth rate was falling. Had the Chinese government left well enough alone, because of urbanization, because of modernization, because of women moving into the workforce, because of rising standards of education, the birth rate would have fallen naturally without coercion. But they weren't content to let that happen. They wanted to drive down the birth rate. So they've eliminated 400 million people from their population. And now, there have been for some years now labor shortages in China's coastal provinces. It is now estimated that in 2 years' time, those labor shortages will be nationwide. Why? Because they've eliminated 400 million people from their population. Eliminating 400 million of the most productive, enterprising people the world has ever seen from your population is not a good thing. Has the Chinese Communist Party lost its collective mind, in other words? You could actually crunch the numbers. You can calculate the present future value of a baby born in China. And if you do that, you find that every baby born in China will contribute several $1,000s more to the gross national product over his or her lifetime than they will consume. Of course, babies start as consumers, but they grow up to produce more than they consume. And the present value of what they will produce over what they will consume is in the positive. And so every death of a Chinese baby, unborn child, or newborn child is a death of a small fortune in Chinese terms. So the Chinese Communist Party has actually made its country poorer by eliminating 400 million people. The same argument applies in the United States, of course, in spades, because we have a much higher standard of living, and our people are more productive in terms of dollars and cents. If you calculate the present future value of a baby born in the United States, making certain assumptions about future growth rates, you find that baby, he or she is worth about $500,000. That is the amount that they will produce much more than they will consume over their lifetime. If you were to buy a bond that you had to pay into for the first 18, 20, 22 years, and then thereafter you would receive income from, that acted like the average worker in the United States, that would be a $500,000 bond. So every abortion in the United States is the death of a small fortune. It makes us all poor. Now that's not the only argument that I use, obviously, but that is the only argument that some people who are interested more in the bottom line will listen to when it comes to these questions. They have no time for the moral arguments. So you meet people where they are, you make the arguments that they will listen to. I also hear all the time that we still hear about the population bomb. It's sort of in the air that we breathe. It managed to find its way into school textbooks in the 1970s, thanks to a piece of legislation on population that was signed by President Richard Nixon. And so even today, our children in elementary, junior high school, and high school still find the myth of overpopulation propagated as fact. I say the myth of overpopulation. I'm not alone in that. The New York Times, in its Millennium Edition back in 2000, surprised me by listing overpopulation as one of the myths of the 20th century. And it is. It's a myth because in order to have a population bomb, in order to have a population explosion, you've got to have a continual doubling. And we now know the world's population will never double again. It will peak at around 8 billion, 8.5 billion in 2040, and then it will begin to decline. Birth rates have fallen farther and faster worldwide than anyone thought possible 30 or 40 years ago. We now have all of the countries in Europe dying. That is, filling more coffins than cradles each year. They're closing down maternity wards in France and Italy and Spain and Germany and opening up geriatric clinics in the hospitals. They're closing down factories that make toys and jeans and opening up graveyard cemeteries. Why? Because the population of those countries is aging and dying. I'm going to be going to Moscow in late June for a demographic summit with some senior Russian leaders. Putin, who in many respects is not a very nice guy, is nonetheless very concerned about what he calls the demographic catastrophe that is affecting Russia. Russia is losing 750,000 people each year. Before your population starts dying, of course, it first ages. And so the average age of the Russian population is climbing, and it is shrinking. Russia will never be able, unless it turns around this looming demographic catastrophe, Russia will never be able to develop because there will be too few young people coming into the workforce, too few young people starting businesses, buying homes, cars, driving the economy forward. So I'm looking forward to that meeting. The Russians have assured us that there will be 10,000 people present at the conference. We said, all right, how can you be sure that there will be 10,000 people at the conference? And the fellow sitting across the table said, well, I own the Russian railways. He's the oligarch who, when the Soviet Union broke up, got the railroads. He said, I own the Russian railroads, and I will give 10,000 passes, free passes on the railroad so that people can come. And the fellow who owns the hotels, the former state-run hotels, the oligarch who got all the hotels, said, I will give 10,000 free rooms. Don't worry, they will come. That's how you do things in the former Soviet Union. So I fully expect 10,000 people to be there. Free transportation, free room, free food. You know, who's going to turn that down? And what we're going to tell the Russian people, what I'm going to tell the Russian government is look, it is an illusion to think that everybody is, you can somehow create a system of incentives to ensure that everybody has exactly 2.1 children, which is what you need for so-called zero population growth. That will never happen. There will be some people who choose not to marry. There will be some people who choose, if they marry, not to have children. That's fine. We have a name for those kinds of people, don't we? We call them liberals. That's fine. If they want to do that, fine. But there are also people in your population who want to marry and who want to be generous in having children. And those people are your seed corn. Those people, those couples, those young couples are the couples that you have to treasure and protect from excessive government taxation. Young couples who are willing to have children shouldn't be paying any taxes because they're paying the cost of raising the next generation of Americans, of Russians, of Germans. You see, the Germans, the Europeans are doing it the wrong way now. They have confiscatory taxation rates. You probably know about that living in Massachusetts. And they take about 60% of a family's income in taxes. And they all say we have pronatal policies in place. And what that pronatal policy consists of in Germany and Austria is Kindergeld. So they take 60% of your income in taxes, and then you have a child, they send you back 100 euros a month. If you have 2 children, they send you back 200 euros a month. In other words, they take most of your income and then they give you back a pittance every month and they say, now go and have children. That doesn't work. None of those policies have worked. That's why the birth rate in European countries is still so low. In Italy, they're averaging 1.1 child per woman. In Spain, 1.2. In Germany, about 1.5, but Germany has a large Turkish minority which is having a slightly higher birth rate. So in order to replace the current population, you don't need everybody to have 2.1 children, but you do need about 20 or 25% of the population, a quarter of the population, to be generous in having children. If you shelter them from taxes, if you let those young couples have their desired family size, which may be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 children, then everything balances out. Everything balances out. And so that's what you've got to do. We have done things a little better in this country than they did in Europe because we passed a child tax credit some years ago, back in the 90s, which gives a $1,000 tax credit for every child under 16, as some of you know. Along with the per dependent deduction, that means that young couples of modest income often don't pay much in the way of income tax. They get money back from the government. Still paying Social Security tax, they shouldn't be paying that either. Young couples who are willing to have children should be sheltered from Social Security as well, because they're providing for the future in the most fundamental way by providing the future generation. And unless we have a future generation, there won't be a Social Security program in the future anyway. So I'm going to try to get back up on these videos because I've got a couple more to show you. I knew I shouldn't have let the techie leave. Okay. But I have one that my guys did about food, because food has been the, of course, one of the primary arguments of the population controllers from the beginning. I mean, Paul Ehrlich, my former colleague at Stanford University in 1968, wrote a book called The Population Bomb, in which he said, the opening sentence of the book is this: the battle to feed humanity is over. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in the 1970s. Well, that's a testable proposition, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in the 1970s. We got through the 1970s, and as those of you who lived through it know, hundreds of millions of people did not starve to death in the 1970s. Instead, we had Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution, which increased grain yields per hectare, beyond what anybody imagined would be possible 20 years before. And so India went from being an importer of grain to being an exporter of grain. India was his ugly poster child of overpopulation along with China. He thought there would be tens of millions of people falling dead in the streets in New Delhi, and it didn't happen. Now, you would think that a person who made such a high-profile prediction, which failed, would utter a public apology. Well, you know, being a Stanford University professor means that you never have to say you're sorry, because he didn't say he was sorry. No, he went on to write another book called, the first one was The Population Bomb. The book that he wrote 10 years later was called The Population Explosion. And guess what? The battle to feed humanity was still over. Hundreds of millions of people were going to starve to death in the 1980s. He pushed back his prediction by 10 years. But nonetheless, you know, he continued to go on Johnny Carson. He went on Johnny Carson about 47 times. Carson loved him for some reason. But, you know, scary stories make good copy. I mean, it holds people's interest to know the world is going to end in a few years. His book sold millions of copies. He would go places and pull down honorary of $10 or $20 or $30,000 a pop. And so you ask, you know, doesn't someone like that learn his lesson? You know, well, he did. He learned that if you tell enough apocalyptic stories, you become rich and famous, and you get on Johnny Carson 47 times. I mean, he learned his lesson. Now we have food. Let's talk about food for a minute.
According to believers in overpopulation, there are so many of us on the planet that food production cannot possibly keep up. However, according to both the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Food Program, there is currently enough food on the planet for everyone to be well fed. Not only that, but we're growing this food on less land than we did in the past. This is why in the United States, for example, the government can afford to pay farmers not to grow food, but instead return their farmlands to the wild. Modern technology also allows us to grow food on land where it would have been impossible to do so, even a few years ago. Agricultural experts even believe that Africa, if cultivated using modern farming methods, could eventually feed the whole world, all by itself. Then why are people in many parts of the world starving? The World Food Program lists key causes of hunger, and overpopulation is not on that list. War, one of the leading causes of world hunger, destroys crops and disrupts relief efforts. Widespread poverty prevents many from buying the food that they need. And a lack of infrastructure means that there isn't a reliable way to transport food to areas that need it. This is why reducing the number of hungry people will not make the remaining people less hungry. Those who have access to the food will continue to have access to it, and those who don't will still be hungry. Reducing population will not magically cause food to be spread around equally. And blaming overpopulation for everything does nothing but distract us from the real problems that we actually have. Think about it.
I think we're up to total on these few videos. We're up to about 1 million views. So they're pretty popular. And I think they make the point very well. I was on the Laura Ingraham show a couple days ago, and I was actually debating, not Laura, because Laura and I would have trouble debating anything we agree on a lot, but I was debating a fellow who'd just written a book called The World Without Us. A world without us. You see, we're sort of supernumeraries on planet Earth, and the world would be better off without us. You get the idea. It was great fun. The debate was, he said we're running out of food, and I said, well, if that's the case, why does the Food and Agriculture Organization, based in Rome but part of the United Nations, say that with current agricultural technology we have the ability to feed 14 billion people? He was silent. I said, and you know that we're never going to reach 14 billion people, and we're probably not going to reach 9 billion, where population is going to peak in a few decades at around 8 billion. There is hunger in the world, but that's because we're not getting food to the parts of the world that need it because of conflict. I mean, think about the Sudan. There was a war between the Arab population of northern Sudan and the black population of southern Sudan, and the Arabs who had all the guns interdicted all the food convoys, preventing food aid from getting to the southerners who were starving. That was a man-made famine. In fact, consider the worst famine in the world, which is the famine that occurred in China from 1960 to 1962 in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward. 42 million people starved to death. In the village I was living in, there was a grave, mass grave of a couple hundred people who had starved to death in that period of time. And that was a famine so bad that entire villages in North China and Central China starved to death, to the last man, woman, and child. What caused it? Well, in 1958, Chairman Mao Zedong herded everybody into the well-known people's communes and forced the land to be farmed in common. He put the enterprises under the control of Communist Party cadres who were very good at shouting slogans, but in many cases knew very little about agriculture. He then, in 1959, decided that China was going to catch Great Britain in steel production in the next 3 years, and so he took the people, the peasants, out of the fields where they had been busy growing food and put them in the business of building backyard smelters and other ridiculous projects. Grain was left to rot in the fields, and by the next year there was a food shortage. They ran out of food in the common kitchens. You see, it was illegal in the commune to cook in your own kitchen. All of the the Chinese cooking pots were confiscated. In fact, they weren't just confiscated, they were melted down to cast pig iron ingots and sent to the government to show the government that they were busy catching up with Great Britain in steel production. So they couldn't have cooked at home if they wanted to. Then the communal kitchens ran out of food, the crops had rotted in the fields, and there was nothing to eat. Mao was worried at that point that the people might rise up against him. And so he did two things. The first thing he did was he sent the army out into the countryside to collect the last stores of grain from starving peasants. Because he knew that it really didn't make a difference, it wouldn't really make a difference to him and the Communist Party if a few million peasants starved to death. But if the workers in the cities got too hungry, they might riot and overthrow his regime. So he was determined to keep the workers well fed enough so they wouldn't die. So he took all the grain away from the countryside, fed the army very well. The army has the weapons, you don't want them to be unhappy. Fed the workers in the cities enough to keep them alive. They tightened their belts, but most of them survived the famine. And he left 42 million people to die in the countryside. A deliberate act of mass murder, I believe, because he could have admitted that there was a grain shortage. And the United States and Canada and Australia, the great grain-producing countries of the world, would have responded generously by sending ships full of grain to China. But he didn't want to admit, for reasons of personal pride, that his communes had failed. And so he kept it a secret. He brought in a few selected foreign journalists, friends of China, the kind of people who, unlike me, can get visas whenever they walk into the Chinese embassy. And he showed them stockpiles of food in a model people's commune right outside of Beijing, and said that the stories that people are starving in China is just fabricated. We've had bumper crops. We don't need food aid. Meanwhile, people are starving in the villages. Worst famine in human history was not caused by overpopulation. It was caused by the deliberate mismanagement of the economy, of agriculture in particular, and then a deliberate decision on the part of the political leader to let a certain percentage of the people die so that the people he was worried about keeping happy and well fed would have enough to eat. Man-made famine. So that's food. That's the food question. It comes up all the time. You know, we really have to think of people as a resource. And even economics, you know, until the last couple decades, has thought a lot about different kinds of inputs, technology and capital and so forth, to production, but hasn't thought enough about human beings as the ultimate resource. Pope Benedict XVI made the case for people in his recent encyclical, Charity and Truth, writing that, quote, "To consider population increase as the primary cause of underdevelopment is mistaken, even from an economic point of view." I believe that if you look at human history, as our numbers have grown, so has our prosperity. Ask yourself, would you like to be alone on a desert island, responsible for providing for your own food and shelter? Any of you who've seen Survivor Man or any of the other reality shows on TV know how difficult it is. That life in the wild, life in nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And that it is as our numbers grow, we can have division of labor, we can specialize in different things, and our standard of living will go up. And that applies worldwide. In the year 1800, the population of the world was about 1 billion, and the per capita income worldwide was about $100 per head. We passed 2 billion in 1927. By then, the per capita income was $500. So our numbers had doubled, but per capita income had gone up 5 times. 1960, we went to 3 billion, another increase of 50% from 2 to 3 billion, but per capita income had tripled again to 1,500. When we passed 6 billion in 2000, per capita income was around $5,000. Every man, woman, and child on the planet. Now that average masks, of course, huge disparities, but the general point nevertheless stands, that as our numbers have grown, so has our prosperity, and it only makes sense. The more creative human intelligences you have at work solving our problems, the more progress you can expect to have. We in the pro-life movement often think about the scientific advances that we didn't see because, you know, the scientist who invented the cure for this or that kind of cancer was aborted 45 years ago instead of being allowed to pursue his research, and so on and so forth. I go to Congress from time to time and testify. I was once in the halls of Congress arguing in favor of less funding for population control programs. I argue that population control programs are basically money for nothing. Money for nothing. And I happened to run into a population control enthusiast who thought all of the world's problems were caused by too many people. And I was there with Dr. Stephen Karanja, who was the head of the Kenyan Medical Association, who was telling congressmen that what we need in Kenya is what you don't send us. You send us condoms and contraceptives and IUDs, and we don't need those things because our medical clinics are stacked to the ceiling with those kinds of things. What we need are malarial tablets and penicillin for pneumonia. What we need are help with primary health care. But all you send us are these drugs and devices to reduce our number. And the population control activist said, well, you see, there are too many people in Kenya. Dr. Karanja, who was a very genial fellow, didn't smack him. But he said, and the population control enthusiast went on to say, he said, there are too many people in Kenya. There's enough room in Kenya for the elephants and the rhinoceroses and the lions. And Dr. Karanja said mildly, he said, well, sir, 1/3 of my country is already a game preserve. What do you want us Kenyans to do? Move into the sea? But the population control enthusiast got really upset when he found out that I had 9 children. And he drew himself up to his full height, and he said, you pro-lifers just have all those children so you can dominate the political process. And I had to laugh because I said to him, you know, when my wife and I talk about whether or not we should welcome another little soul into this world, cooperate with God and bring another soul into existence who will share life with us in this world and hopefully eternity with us in the next, the last thing we're talking about is dominating the political process. I said, how many children do you have? He said, well, I'm not married, I don't have any.
Of course.
I said, well, you understand that it's going to be my children in the future who are making your Social Security payments, don't you? In that giant program, giant Ponzi scheme that we run from Washington. He didn't like that. But he didn't like what I had to say then even more, because I said, you understand that you're getting older, and when you have your first heart attack, now I hope you have a long life, but when you have your first heart attack, you know it's going to be one of my children who's driving the ambulance to answer the 911 call. It's going to be one of my children who's the paramedic, or someone who's pro-life is going to be the paramedic who gets your heart started again. It's going to be the child of a pro-lifer who does the open heart surgery on you to save your life. It's going to be the child of a pro-lifer who cares for you in the NICU as you recover. Said, it won't be one of your children because you don't have any. That was probably a little mean, but it's all true. It's all true. You know, these people are dependent upon the rest of us. You know, that the government can do many things. A few things well, many things poorly. But one thing governments cannot do is reproduce. They cannot produce the next generation. And those people who provide for the future in the most fundamental way by providing the future generation should be regarded as national treasures. I have one more video. Yeah, okay, 2.1 kids. Let me show this, and I'll show the other one real quick because I'm afraid we're running out of time.
From the time of the cavemen all the way until today, humanity continues to exist because each generation of people has produced another generation to replace itself. Scientists have figured out how many people need to be born each generation to replace the generation before. That number is 1 person per person. All things being equal, this creates perfect demographic balance. Since women are the only ones who can have children, replacing every person on Earth means each woman needs to have 2 children, one to replace her, and the other to replace the man, who cannot have children. The total fertility rate is the average number of children each woman in a society is having. This number shows us if a society is growing or shrinking. In developed countries, the replacement rate birth rate is 2.1 children per woman. This will keep the population stable, but even that is assuming that every woman has children, and that there are no wars, famines, or disease. In the real world, disasters happen all the time, and sadly not all children reach adulthood, especially in poor countries. This pushes their replacement rate up to 3.3 children per woman. Since not every woman wants to have children, in order to keep the population stable, some women need to have more than 2.1 children to balance the birth rate with the women who are only having 1, or no children at all. Maintaining this balance is of the utmost importance. If society does not at least replace itself every generation, human numbers begin to fall exponentially. Economic and social problems appear, as elderly people retiring begin to outnumber young people entering the workplace. This is already happening all over the developed world. Many of the world's nations are only barely replacing themselves, while a growing majority have birth rates below replacement, some as low as 1.8 or even 1.2 babies per woman. Many societies are facing a very real danger: extinction.
So we use Japan as an example there, because Japan is a country that legalized abortion back in 1949. And by 1964, the birth rate had fallen below 2.1, below replacement. And so for the last almost 50 years, they've been having too few children to replace themselves. The population of Japan peaked 5 years ago at about 126 million. It's now shrinking from year to year. And Japan has never been particularly welcoming of new immigrants. It's a fairly insular society. I spent several years there in the early 70s. I was an officer of the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War. So I have an interest in Japan. The Japanese government is frantic to get the birth rate up, but hasn't been able to figure out how to do it. Right now, the Japanese are averaging about 1.2 children per woman. They're in the middle of a 20-year demographic recession. I say a demographic recession because it's caused by these falling numbers of workers in the workforce. They have a national debt which is twice the annual GDP. You know, they're they're a country that is dying. They will lose 50 million people by the end of the century. Bring their population from 126 million down to 75 million or so. And after that, the decline will continue. In fact, the Japanese Ministry of Health a few years ago calculated that unless the birth rate of Japan increases, by the year 3000 there will only be 500 Japanese left. Now that sounds like a joke, but it's a mathematical certainty that if each generation only has, fails to replace itself, the numbers will shrink over time. And Japan is rapidly reaching the point of no return, like Spain, like Italy, like other countries where the birth rate has been so low for so long that it's impossible to envision how they could ever restore balance to their population. If you look at Italy now, 1.1 children per woman over her reproductive lifetime. That means the population is going to be cut in half with each generation. One Italian demographer that I know said that in 50 years there will be more Albanians in Italy than Italians. That may be a slight exaggeration. But the number of immigrants is growing, the number of native Italians is shrinking. And the number of native-born Italians is so low that every young Italian couple would have to marry in their early 20s and have 4 children in order to stave off population decline. And it's almost impossible to imagine a combination of incentives that would allow that to happen. So once this population decline is in place and continues for a certain length of time, it's very difficult to come out of it. It's like a plane in a dive. It picks up speed, it accelerates, and it's hard to turn around. And a crash becomes almost inevitable. Japan is going to have a hard time recovering from its current disasters precisely because of the lack of young people in the economy. It's no accident that more than half the world's industrial robots are in Japan because they have so few workers. They need to depend more and more on robots. They actually are now designing robot grandchildren in Japan, which are selling very well. Elderly people who have no children or grandchildren will buy a robot that looks like a human child and is programmed to ask several thousand questions, actually to carry on simple conversations. It will say things like, "Grandpa, why do birds fly?" And "Grandpa, why is the sky blue?" And so if you're an elderly Japanese, you can pretend for a while that you actually have a grandchild. There's also the renting of families on a weekend or weekly basis. For elderly Japanese who never married, had no children, you can rent a family for a weekend or for a week, a young couple, a husband and wife, and 1 or 2 children, so that you can again pretend for a while that you had, that your children that you never had actually exist. So it's a sad thing to watch these countries die. I've got one more video to show you, and then I think we'll move to questions.
When human beings first showed up on this planet, there weren't very many of us. And we faced a hard life of meeting our basic needs. Chances are, early humans spent a good deal of time hungry, cold, and without shelter. That is to say, poor. According to the World Bank, poverty is when people are deprived of well-being as a result of low income and aren't able to get the basic goods that they need for survival with dignity. How did any of the human race advance beyond poverty? We kept multiplying and we formed communities. In communities, people stop spending all their time on simple survival and are able to do things like divide up tasks, share resources, and pool their mental energies to come up with creative solutions to problems. These communities started with families, then grew into extended families, entire tribes, and then finally cities and nations. So what effect has this growth had on poverty? According to demographers, a very good one. In fact, history shows that as our numbers have grown, so has our average standard of living. Scientists measure this standard in everything from per capita income to average amount of calories consumed, even average height. And all of these averages have been increasing. Even though poverty still exists, the percentage of poor people has actually decreased as population has grown. The reason for this is that human beings are not simply consumers, we are producers. This is why, over the ages, we have learned how to do things like produce more food on less land, find better energy sources, and make sure that more people have enough to eat and a roof over their heads. And this is also why, though urban poverty is still a huge problem, statistics show that the poor who move to large communities actually have better chances of rising from poverty than they did in areas where there were fewer jobs and less opportunity. For this reason, poverty is a problem that is not solved by eliminating people. Poverty has always been a problem, even when there were scarcely any people on the entire planet. People are the only proven way out of poverty. Removing them will only leave the poor right where they started. Think about it.
Well, as you know, I'm a writer, and writers write books. And I've brought some books along here because we don't have time to talk about all the things that we should talk about. But this is a book, A Mother's Ordeal, about China. And this was a story that I wrote first for the Reader's Digest years ago about a woman who was fleeing China's forced abortion program. And then I decided, when I found out that she had been a population control worker in China, and that she herself had been in the business of victimizing women and bringing them in for forced abortions until she became pregnant with her second child and decided that she wanted to keep that child, I thought her story was worth telling. It's a very interesting tale, but for anyone who's interested in what's going on in China, what's still going on in China, this is the book for you. China, by the way, has announced that it may end the one-child policy in 2015, which my way of thinking is 34 years too late. But that seems to imply more than it actually does, because they will go to a two-child policy. So there will still be forced abortions and forced sterilization, forced contraception. But it will be performed on people, not women who are pregnant with their second children, but women who are pregnant with their third or higher order children. It still means that the state will control reproduction and dictate how many children people can have, namely 2 instead of 1. And should the day come that the Chinese people decide that they don't want to have children, as the people of Beijing and Shanghai have already decided, because those the birth rates in those big cities are well below 1, then I think the Chinese government will use their control of reproductive systems to dictate to people to bear children. So the radical feminists who complain that pro-lifers want to keep women barefoot and pregnant really ought to be worried about the socialists in China, because they will force women to be pregnant who don't want to be, if it comes to that. The topic we've been talking about today is population control. This is the book that I wrote a couple of years ago. Contains a lot of examples: Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Muslim world, North America. And when I was in China, I not only became pro-life and became aware of people as the most valuable resource. When I was in that room witnessing forced abortion, I also began to seek God, because I was confronted with this hellish scene of a forced abortion of a woman who was almost ready to give birth. And so I began to seek God. So that was Finding God in China, is the title of my conversion story, and that's in the Ignatius Press book, Chosen. So anybody who's interested in my own faith journey, that would be a book for you. And finally, I wrote a book with Chuck DeVore, who ran for the U.S. Senate seat from California a few months ago, unfortunately lost. But for those of you who are worried about China's growing military might, we wrote a book about China's attack on Taiwan, China attacks. Interesting read, if you like Tom Clancy. I've donated all these books to PRI, Population Research Institute, so anyone who wants a copy is making a donation to our pro-life work. With that, let me open it to questions. Yes, sir.
You made a comment, Steve, about the relationship between sort of the doomsday scenarios on Social Security in this nation and the approximately 50 million abortions since Roe v. Wade.
Well, this is, I've been in the middle of doing calculations like this for years with various economists, and the 50-some million children that we've aborted in this country, more than half would have entered upon their productive years by this time, and they would be making a great economic contribution to the economy. I'm not saying that we wouldn't have a budget deficit because of out-of-control government spending, but I think that deficit would be a lot smaller because we would have a lot more people paying into the system. It's also clear that if you instead of having a total fertility rate of 2 children, which is what we have in the United States right now, which is actually better than the rest of the developed world. We are in better shape demographically than anybody, bar none. We're better shape than Canada, France, you name it. That preventing those children from being eliminated by abortion would have kept the total fertility rate up close to 3. And if you have 3 children, the Social Security program, you can do the calculations, would have stayed solvent forever. Because with every increase of 0.1 in the total fertility rate, so if you go from 2 to 2.1 on average children, you increase the solvency of the you lengthen the period of solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund by 3 years. So if you went from 2 to 3, you'd lengthen it by 30 years, a generation and a half, you'd effectively solve your problem, get us through the baby boomer retirement problem. You know, I was born in 1948, I'm a baby boomer. So Roe versus Wade effectively gutted the Social Security system and is forcing us, is going to force us to make major changes in it.
Thank you.
Aside from stunting our economic growth, costing us probably 0.5% of growth in GDP from year to year. I mean, and it continues to ramify because the youngest of the children eliminated by Roe versus Wade would have married and be having children themselves. So every abortion, of course, is not just the death of a small person, which it is, it's the death of an entire line of people who would have followed from that. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on the work of the UN Population Control Fund and the UN agencies that are working throughout the world to limit population in Africa and most of the world?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I would actually be happy to go to the UN Population Fund and personally turn out the lights. Because if there ever was an organization that needed a sunset clause, it was the UN Population Fund. In fact, we didn't need the UN Population Fund in 1968 when it was first set up under its first head. It was set up as a result of this fear-mongering of explosive population growth. We were behind it. It would never have gotten off the ground if the United States under Lyndon Johnson hadn't supported the idea of setting it up. We have also been funding it from the beginning, on and off. I had something to do with defunding it, and I want to defund it again. The first time we defunded it was in the 1980s. I came back from China. I went to Congress, testified before the House and Senate on what was happening in China's one-child policy, the forced abortions, the forced sterilizations we've talked about. I pointed out that the UN Population Fund went into China in 1979, the same year that I did. And then it took me a short time to figure out that this was a barbaric forced abortion policy and that the United States and the world should have no part of. And I said the UN Population Fund is still in China. It is supporting China's one-child policy. It is providing things like computers to the State Family Planning Commission so they can calculate the number of children who will be allowed to be born each year, and other things. And I said this organization does not deserve U.S. funds. There was an amendment passed by Jack Kemp and Bob Caston, Senator Bob Caston from Wisconsin. Jack Kemp, you all know. Prohibiting any U.S. funding from going to any country or organization that participates in the management or support of a program of forced abortion or forced sterilization. I met with Jack Kemp and Bob Caston, and that was what they came up with to cut off funding to the UNFPA. The funding was cut in 1985. It stayed cut until 1993, when Bill Clinton came into office, and without looking at the evidence. This is what really upsets a person like me who is trying to find evidence-based reasons for policies. Without looking at the evidence of the UN Population Fund's complicity in forced abortion in China, decided to turn on the funding spigot again. Well, we had another election a couple terms later, and the Population Research Institute went into China in 2001, and so when Bush took office, we had evidence, like fresh evidence of the UN Population Fund's involvement in forced abortion in China. We presented it to the Bush administration. They took a look at the evidence and decided to cut off funding. The funding stayed cut off until 2009, and then what happened? The funding now gets turned back on again. Nobody's looking at the evidence. They don't care. They're committed population controllers. They're so committed to abortion, they don't care that it's the taking of a human life. They don't care that it's the elimination of the most valuable resource the planet has ever seen. They're doing it for ideological reasons. Well, first of all, let me thank you all for choosing me over pizza.
It's not till 5.
I'll keep it short, yeah. There may still be a few pieces left over.
Mention the topics.
Oh, that's true, yeah. You've been very patient, yes.
The saddest sight that I have seen in a long time is when I was in China, I was smuggling in Bibles in the year 2000,
Mhm.
and I never saw a little girl. I only saw little boys, and I was so sad by that. The happiest sight for me was when I was coming down to the United States, and I met a couple who had just adopted a little girl. And I said, thank you, Lord, because this is the first little girl I've seen in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. If the Chinese government would let me in, and they you know, it's difficult for international spies like me to get visas. Although I was just in China last year, but I've often, thought of adopting little girls from China. I encourage the adoption of little girls in China. We've actually done some things in that regard. We've set up a couple of orphanages in China. And if you go to a Chinese state-run orphanage or a private orphanage, you see two kinds of children. You see little girls, perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, no birth defects, no problems at all, except, of course, they were not wanted because they were little girls. They were abandoned in favor of a son that the parents hoped would be conceived after they got rid of their little girl. And you also find handicapped children of both sexes, because China's one-child policy is also a eugenics program. And I mean, the governing slogan of the policy is late marriage. You want people to marry late so they have fewer children. Late births, you don't allow people to have children as soon as they get married, they have to wait for a permit. Few births, which means in the cities 1, and which means in the countryside, in some cases 2. If your first child is a girl, you can have a second child. If your first child is a boy, you have to stop. And then, but the fourth part of the slogan is quality births, Youshang in Chinese. And what quality births means is that the Chinese government only wants superior babies to be born. And when this first began, one of the series of articles I wrote was about this eugenics program, and the Chinese government got very upset and said, well, we're not, I compared it to the Nazis' program to breed Superman. And the Chinese government said, our program should not be compared to the Nazis. We're not trying to breed Superman, we're just trying to breed a better breed of man and woman, which was a distinction without a difference. So what that means is that if you're only allowed one child, or in the countryside sometimes 2, and the government is pressing you to have perfect children, it means that you abandon not just little girls, but you abandon children who are handicapped. And by handicapped, I don't mean spina bifida. I don't mean heart defects. I mean babies are abandoned for having skin blemishes. Babies are abandoned for having cleft palate, for having clubbed feet. Babies are abandoned for the most trivial reasons, because the government is saying we only want to have perfect children. So those are the two kinds of children that you find in the orphanages. But I've always encouraged adoption because every baby adopted from China is a life saved. The state-run orphanages are a little better now than they were when we started looking into this 15 years ago. But for example, I had a missionary friend like you, who went into China for us, visited a state-run orphanage in Nanning in southern China. And the state-run orphanage had 2 sections. It had an infant section for babies up to the age of 2, and then it had an older children's section for children over the age of 2. And our missionary said, well, how many children are promoted from the infant section to the older children's section each year? And the orphanage director said, none. And she said, what do you mean? And he said, they all die. He said, every few months we have an epidemic of influenza or something that comes in here, and all the babies die, and then of course the new babies are being brought in all the time. The babies were being put in cribs. They were not being handled, they were not being loved, they were not being changed, they were being fed rice gruel instead of milk. Rice gruel, of course, is mostly starch, it has very little protein. And they just didn't they had very low survival rates. The death rates in some of these places were 80%, 90% a year. That means if you're there a year, your chance of surviving is only 10 or 20%. If you're there 2 years, it's half that. So we worked with the church in China to set up a couple of orphanages. We're not directly involved in that anymore, although I visited them. What we do in China is we run a series of safe houses. A safe house is like a crisis pregnancy center in the United States, only it's illegal. It's a place where a woman who's pregnant can go into hiding from the government officials who are trying to hunt her down. And they stay inside the safe house. We give them whatever clothing they need. They prepare their own food. We keep them there until they're ready to give birth, and we have someone come in and deliver the baby. Normally, after that, they go away with the baby to a new place. They can't go back to their native place because they're on a watch list. They're on a list, so we have to resettle them somewhere else. And the numbers aren't huge. I mean, we're just talking about a couple dozen women a year, but every life saved is worth the entire material universe, because the material universe will one day pass away, but the soul will last forever. So we do that. So I mean, this is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. I left China years ago with the pleas for help of women ringing in my ears, and I couldn't do anything because I was there, as a guest of the Chinese government. I couldn't speak out against the program. All I could do is wait until I left the country and then tell my story to the world, tell their story to the world. But I've been fighting this fight ever since.
God bless you.
So.
Has there anything been done to try and change the philosophy of the value of women in China?
Yeah, the Chinese government blames female infanticide on feudal attitudes. In other words, it blames the people. The reason that little girls are abandoned after birth, the government says, the reason that little girls are killed at birth, according to the government, is because of this traditional feudal notion that boys are more valuable than girls. Okay? But I'm here to tell you that in the areas of China that I've done research, there was no female infanticide before the beginning of the one-child policy. Not to say there wasn't the killing of little girls in Chinese history in remote rural areas in poor provinces, of course there was. But in Guangdong, Canton province, where I was, along the coast where people are relatively well off, they raised all of their children, their little boys and little girls as well as their little boys. And it was only after the one-child policy began that I began to get reports of little girls dying in mysterious circumstances shortly after birth. So, I don't buy the government's argument that it's the survival of these feudal attitudes. It's the one-child policy. By limiting couples to one child, or at most now two, they're forcing couples to choose. And in China, the custom has always been that the sons take care of the parents. You see, the Chinese Communist Party does not live up to its name because it does not have a socialist economic system. There are retirement benefits and medical benefits for party personnel. There are retirement and medical benefits for workers in state-run factories, but the villagers are on their own. And the only retirement program known to villagers, and to the large floating population of villagers, 100 million who now live around the cities and work in assembly plants, is a son who will grow up and work in the factories, work in the fields in your place. And so by imposing the one-child policy on the people on the one hand, by not providing for the support of the elderly in their old age on the other, the Chinese government forces couples to choose between boys and girls, and some of them, sadly, will choose to abandon or even kill a little girl. In parts of China, they keep a bucket of water by the birthing bed, and the midwife comes in, delivers the baby, and if the baby is a little girl, they take her and they plunge her into the bucket of water before she has a chance to draw her first breath. And the bucket of water is called the eliminating problem bucket. If the little baby that's born is a little boy, they still use the bucket of water to wash him off. And then the bucket of water is called the washing the root bucket. The root is gun in Chinese, which means your roots, your family line, your lineage. So it's, so that's what they do. And millions of little girls have been, well, tens of millions of little girls have been eliminated in this fashion. In recent years, it's more common now to have sex-selective abortion, where at 6 or 7 months gestation, where you can detect the sex of the unborn child by ultrasound, a couple will go in, and if the ultrasound reveals male genitalia, they'll celebrate. If it reveals a female, then they'll schedule an abortion. So it's sex-selective abortion, female infanticide. 30 million young men will not be able to find brides in China because their brides have been eliminated before birth. Yes?
You said that earlier on that because of China's lowering population, that workforces won't be able to find a new generation to take the jobs. Now, even though it's a horrible thing, how does the debt that the U.S. owes to China decrease because of that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Which is a whole other topic. But in brief, what the Chinese government has done for the last 30 years, in order to be able to sell cheap goods overseas, is it has artificially kept wages very, very low in China. Okay? The workers in China get $1 a day, something like that. They are not allowed to organize into labor unions. They are not allowed to strike. They are not allowed to engage in even work slowdowns. They are forced to stay in their dormitories on weeknights. In some of these factories, they're locked up in dormitories every night. They're only allowed out to wander about the city on Sunday afternoon. They're treated like serfs. With the complicity of the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party is so bent on economic development that it has promised and kept the workers in China from collectively bargaining, trying to improve their lot. Okay? So that's kept prices low. The other way they've kept prices low is by artificially devaluing their currency so that their goods are cheaper over here than they would be if the yuan was allowed to rise to its real level, which would be an increase of value in 30%, 35% or so. So those two things, devaluing your currency, and they kept their currency devalued by buying huge amounts of U.S. Treasury bonds. They buy our bonds, right? They buy. So they got $1 trillion worth of our bonds. That helps to depress their currency, and they kept their wages low. If they have a worker shortage, the factory owners, and the Communist Party owns a lot of the factories in China, not just directly, but indirectly. These communist cadres, once China began to move in the direction of the free market, used their political connections to be secret partners in a lot of these so-called private enterprises in China. So they really are in a political and economic elite now. When the workers, that worker shortage becomes acute, they're going to have to pay the workers more, which is going to increase the value of goods made in China, increase the cost of making goods in China, and increase the price in the United States. And yeah, that is going to help to rectify the trade balance. But I worry about other things. You've got 30 million young men in China who will not be able to find brides, who will not be able to form families and have normal lives. You've got rates of rape, gang activity way up in China. China will have no trouble recruiting a military in years to come because of all these young unattached males. The military is kind of an alternative family for young men. This is a very destabilizing element of Chinese society and something that I'm worried about.
Just one more question.
I think we have time for just one more.
Yeah, I wanted to switch countries a little bit. A few years ago, under the old Soviet Union, the population dropped so drastically in the Soviet Union that when the so-called free government came in, they actually started paying couples to have children.
Yeah.
Has that worked for them, and is it still going on, and what would that do to an industrial nation?
Well, yeah, the government of China, the government of China, I'm talking about China, the government of Russia pays a child bonus. In fact, it pays the largest child bonus in the world that I know of. A couple who gives birth to a child in Russia gets a one-time payment of $9,000. Now in Australia, they have a child bonus too, you get $5,000, but $9,000 is better than $5,000. The problem is it's a one-time bonus, and you know, it takes 18 years to raise a child to adulthood. So, again, I think the bonus is fine. I think the young couple deserves it, but I think if you shelter them from taxes while the child is growing up, that's probably a better way to do it. That doesn't seem to have had that big an effect on fertility. What it did do was, as soon as the $9,000 bonus was put in place, a lot of young couples decided to have their one child right now because they thought the policy might change. So it didn't increase the total number of children born, but it affected the timing of births. Because, as we know, government policies can change. And people were worried in Russia that they might change. But it hasn't done much for the birth rate overall. Russia, Ukraine, Czech Republic, Belarus, all of those, everything, all of Europe, from Ireland in the west all the way to European Russia in the east, are having far too few children to replace the current populations. It's a dying continent.